Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Dwight Eisenhower, and the focus is victory in Europe. The year is 1944. The Allied invasion of Normandy has been a success. D-Day worked out. French west coast is now in the hands of the Allies, as well as the southern part of France, where the Allies had a separate invasion near the port of Marseille. So they've got a lot of men and material pouring into the central part of France, and the question is, where do they go next? In particular, do they go liberate Paris? Charles de Gaulle, the self-anointed leader of the Free French movement, had come into Eisenhower's headquarters and said, look, if you want the French people to support you in this effort, you got to liberate Paris. But Eisenhower also had some concerns. Number one, well, he got along pretty well with de Gaulle and found him to be useful. President Franklin Roosevelt did not care for de Gaulle at all and did want to do nothing to sort of anoint him into the presidency of France, and so that was a bit of a concern. The other was simply that there was very little military value in liberating Paris. Maybe just better to go around it and go straight into Germany, as Eisenhower is thinking. But again, de Gaulle's arguments were convincing, and Eisenhower agreed that they would take the Allied troops into France. In fact, they would let the French troops lead the way under General Philippe, Leclerc. The French 2nd Armored Division went into Paris on August the 26th. Charles de Gaulle leading a parade down the streets with this victory. 3 days later, a massive celebration in Paris with all of the Allies there, really sending a signal to the world that maybe this thing is finally coming to an end. At this point, there was a change in the command structure for the Allies. Eisenhower is still Supreme Allied Commander, but on September 1st of 1944, he took over operational control of the ground war. We're getting him more involved in the day-to-day decision-making, and he had a decision to make. Where would they go next, and how would they do it? General Bernard Montgomery of the British, who's on the northern sector of the Allied line, said, look, give me 40 divisions. The Germans are on their heels. I'll take sort of a spearhead directly into their lines, break through, go straight into Germany. We will win this war in one fell swoop. That's the right answer. And Eisenhower was a little skeptical. He said, look, such a move would have been sensible only in the event that the spearhead, fed at the cost of the rest of the army, could have actually reached all the way into the center of Germany and ended the war, and he was skeptical. Interestingly, Generals Bradley and Patton from the American side, a little bit further south, had the same kind of idea. Give them a whole bunch of divisions, they'll do the spearhead, and they'll race into Germany and end the war. Eisenhower rejected this plan. He decided to go with a broad front strategy. In fact, his front spanned 300 miles roughly from north to south. It was going to be less risk, but it also slowed the momentum. The Germans had been on their heels, and by changing the strategy and not going with the aggressive route, this allowed the Germans to regroup, reform their defenses, and effectively prolong the war. Even though, again, it was a less risky approach, it also delayed things. And he was strongly criticized in this sense for Eisenhower, including from General Montgomery, who said Eisenhower had not the experience, the knowledge, or the time. He should have been devoting himself to questions of overall strategy, to political problems, to problems of inter-allied relations and military government. Instead, he insisted on trying to run the land battle himself. Here he was out of his depth, and in trying to do this, he neglected his real job on the highest level. From within the American ranks, General George Patton also criticized Ike over the broad front strategy, calling it the most momentous error of the war. And even a German general by the name of Hans Speidel also criticized Eisenhower for this cautious approach. Had the Allies held on grimly to the retreating Germans, they could have harried the breath out of every man and beast and ended the war a half year earlier. There were no German forces of any importance that could be thrown in, and next to nothing in the air. But the broad front strategy slowed things down. Germans were able to reform. They couldn't stop the Allies. That was sort of inevitable at this point, but they could delay longer based on this broad front strategy. December of 1944, President Roosevelt made a change in the ranks. The Allies had folks at the Field Marshal rank, which was a 5-star rank. The Americans only had 4 stars as their top rank, and so he decided to make things equal. 4 U.S. Army generals, 3 U.S. and Navy admirals all got the 5th star, including Dwight Eisenhower, now technically a general of the Army, rose with that 5th star. There was another appointment that also caught Eisenhower's eye surprise here in December of 1944, and that was to Kay Summersby. Kay Summersby, of course, had been his driver since the beginning of the war. We've talked about her in previous episodes. She is now an American citizen. She's now a member of the United States Women's Army Corps, and Eisenhower told her at the time that, look, I told you once I was never going to let you go. If you're a whack, I can keep you on my staff later on, already thinking to the post-war period. Kay Summersby is now a second lieutenant. She's not going to drive for Eisenhower anymore. She's an aide to the Supreme Allied Commander. Wherever he went, she would go. When he went in the car, she would sit now in the back seat next to him instead of in the front seat doing the driving. Well, during this period, December of 1944, Adolf Hitler was not going to give up without one last final push, and he frankly caught the Allies with their pants down. No one expected a major thrust in the middle of winter through the Ardennes forest. Those dense forested areas were only guarded by Eisenhower's 4 divisions, a very small group, because he thought it was completely impractical. Well, those 4 divisions were completely overrun by the Germans as they went into that line through the Ardennes, sending 28 divisions, 400,000 men, 1,500 tanks into the breach. The idea was to split the Allied lines basically in half and then move a little bit further north, retake the port at Antwerp, maybe somehow figure out a way to continue this war. Well, the Germans creating a bulge there in the American defenses, and that's what created the title of this battle, the Battle of the Bulge. Eisenhower, again, caught unawares and had to react quickly. And he did respond well in that he threw in some reserves. He was slow to react a bit, but he also then made some changes in his command at the very top, where some of the forces under General Bradley were realigned to General Montgomery, who was north of the Bulge. This created some internal friction. Bradley was very upset, almost threatened to quit over this, and Eisenhower said, too bad, this is what we have to do in this state of emergency. December the 19th, a couple of days into the Battle of the Bulge, he met with his leadership team in Verdun, and it was a rather sullen atmosphere, trying to figure out what to do to stop this attack by the Germans. And George Patton said, look, here's what I'm going to do. My men are about 100 miles away. I know it's icy terrain, but we're going to pivot 90 degrees, head north, and attack the bottom of this bulge. We can do it with 3 divisions, and I'll get there in 2 days. Well, the whole room was sort of aghast. They were riveted by the idea, but this was impossible. You can't get there in 2 days. And even Eisenhower said, don't be fatuous, George. If you try to go that early, you won't have all 3 divisions ready, and you'll go piecemeal. He said, you know what? You got to take at least 1 extra day. You will start on the 22nd, and I want your initial blow to be a strong one. It was time for George Patton to finally sort of repay Eisenhower for all the times that he had covered for him. Eisenhower then issued something, a rare thing for him, the order of the day to all of the troops under his command. The enemy is making his supreme effort. He's fighting savagely to take back all that you have won and is using every treacherous trick to deceive and kill. In the face of your proven bravery and fortitude, he will completely fail. But we cannot be content with his mere repulse. By rushing out from his fixed defenses, the enemy may give us the chance to turn his greatest gamble into his worst defeat. So I call upon every man of all the Allies to rise to new heights of courage, of resolution, and of effort. This was one of Ike's finest hours, turning disaster into victory in the Battle of the Bulge. They cut off the German supplies. What did that mean? No more gasoline for the tanks. Eventually they ran out of gas and got stuck right where they were. Montgomery was attacking the Bulge from the north. Patton got there in miraculous time to attack from the south, slowly closing that bulge, pushing the Germans back. By the end of January 1945, things were sort of back to where they started. The difference was the Allies had suffered about 80,000 casualties in the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans suffered over 100,000 casualties. They lost about 800 tanks, about 1,000 planes, and for the Germans, all of this was completely irreplaceable. Again, this was sort of the beginning of the very end of the war in Europe. January 20th of 1945, around this same time, President Franklin Roosevelt takes his oath of office for the 4th time, to beginning his 4th term as President of the United States. Almost immediately, he is off to Yalta for another Big Three conference with Britain's Winston Churchill and Russia's Joseph Stalin, really focusing on the post-war plans for Germany, talking about zones of occupation, where they decided that the Russians would have the eastern part of Germany, and the Americans, French, and British would split up the zone zones of occupation in the western side of Germany. They also made another exception in Berlin, which is in the middle of the eastern side, the Russian side of the zone of occupation. Berlin would be sort of this international city that all four nations would have a handle and a zone in within the city of Berlin. So all of this is being decided, and it influences the thinking of Eisenhower on what he's going to do next. Winston Churchill is distraught over some of these decisions because he thinks basically Eastern Europe is now going to land in the hands of the Soviets for good. They already have their military there, and he's pushing Eisenhower after the conference to rush to Berlin, beat the Russians to Berlin to help preserve maybe some of that presence in the eastern part of either Berlin and maybe even Eastern Europe. But Eisenhower really didn't think this made any sense. Berlin is already basically destroyed. It had very little military value, and it was in the Russian zone, so they're going to have to give it back anyway. He confided to General Marshall that, may I point out that Berlin is no longer a particularly important objective. Its usefulness has been largely destroyed, and even the government is preparing to move to another area. Better to go attack the Ruhr. As he said, when the industrial heart of Germany stops beating, the political heart will die, and that was the Ruhr, where they had all the raw materials and industry. That's what Eisenhower wanted to focus on. He and Churchill went back and forth on this, but look, Ike said it was going to cost about 100,000 American casualties if they went for Berlin. He wasn't going to have that risk. He was going to go focus on the Ruhr. To do that, he had to cross the Rhine, and here was good fortune for the Allies because Omar Bradley found one bridge was still left. The Germans destroyed all the bridges over the Rhine except one, and that was the Ludendorff Bridge. And Eisenhower was thrilled at this. He sent 9 divisions across before the Germans eventually did destroy the bridge from the other side. In the meantime, they set up some pontoon bridges, and all of a sudden, Monty, Bradley, they're all converging on the Ruhr. They were eventually had 300,000 Germans surrendered to them. The industrial might of Germany was essentially gone. The next week, April the 12th, President Franklin Roosevelt died. Harry Truman, the vice president, most people didn't know much about. He's now the president of the United States, but there was very little change on the ground. This is close to the end of the war. Ike is in charge. The same day, on April the 12th, Eisenhower witnessed the evilness of Nazism firsthand. He liberated, or was part of the liberation, of a concentration camp, Ordorf Nord, near Gotha. And he told the story in his memoirs, in which he said, "Same day I saw my first horror camp. I've never been able to describe my emotional reactions when I first came face to face with indisputable evidence of Nazi brutality and ruthless disregard of every shred of decency. I'm certain I've never had at any other point experienced an equal sense of shock. I visited every nook and cranny of the camp because I felt it my duty to be in a position from then on to testify at first hand about these things in case there ever grew up at home the belief or assumption that the stories of Nazi brutality were just propaganda." Eisenhower, Bradley, Patton toured this camp. They saw the bodies lined up one on top of another, lice-infested, emaciated bodies of the people who had been murdered in this concentration camp. He invited reporters to come to this particular camp and document the history of what the Germans had done here near Gotha at this concentration camp. A couple weeks later, Adolf Hitler commits suicide. Admiral Karl Donitz takes over the German leadership in a temporary fashion, and he decided, look, it's time for unconditional surrender, the thing that FDR had said all along. He sends General Alfred Jodl to Eisenhower's headquarters in Reims, and they sign the final armistice, where Eisenhower made the comment, "The mission of this Allied force was fulfilled." At 0241 local time, May 7, 1945, World War II in Europe was over. High praise all around for Dwight Eisenhower, especially with the passing of Franklin Roosevelt. He's very much now the face of victory, that broad grin of his, the symbol to the entire world, triumph of good over evil. Now, many would find fault with Eisenhower's battlefield tactics going back to the time in North Africa through to the Battle of the Bulge, but it all worked out in the end. He had victory in North Africa, in Sicily, in Italy, in Normandy, in Paris, the counterattack in the Bulge, the victory in the Ruhr, one after another. Sure, there were little setbacks along the way, but by and large, it was one victory after another. Mostly, Eisenhower was credited as being the unique leader of this grand coalition, the right person in the right place at the right time. Even the highly critical Bernard Montgomery's chief of staff had high praise for the way Eisenhower conducted himself. He said for his human qualities, his sense of humor, his common sense, and his essential honesty and integrity, he inspired love and unfailing loyalty, and he knew how to find a solution along the lines of compromise without surrendering a principle. These were the things you needed in a coalition leader in a different kind of war, and Dwight Eisenhower Eisenhower was the man. Well, Ike at the end of the war was obviously exhausted. He was in high demand for all kinds of speaking engagement. He turned down almost all of them, but he did accept an opportunity to speak at the 600-year-old Guildhall in London, where he was honored as a free man of the city of London. Also was going to be given the Order of Merit by King George VI. This was the first major public address for Dwight Eisenhower. He worked really hard on his speech, and he said in this address to preserve his freedom of worship, his equality before law, his liberty to speak and act as he sees fit, subject only to provisions that he trespass not upon similar rights of others, a Londoner will fight. So will a citizen of Abilene. When we consider these things, then the valley of the Thames draws closer to the farms of Kansas and the plains of Texas. High praise for Eisenhower, putting in context what it meant to bring this coalition together for the good of mankind. Eisenhower then went to the United States, where he met with President Truman. He spoke to a joint session of Congress. They had a ticker tape parade in New York. He eventually then went home to Abilene to have a bit of a celebration. Everyone's talking about Dwight Eisenhower. What's his future going to be? That's a story for another day. That's Dwight Eisenhower and Victory in Europe from the life of Dwight Eisenhower. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher. This is Presidential Chronicles.